Happy Monday, Matt. How are you doing?
Doing well. Happy Monday, Joe. How are you?
Oh, great, man. Great. Just went to the gym this morning and did a bunch of squats. So started the day
Nice.
off right.
You feeling
Yeah.
that?
No, I squat a ton. So it's
Okay.
like
All
it's every
right.
meathead Mondays, I guess. So
Okay. Got to keep one foot in the meathead world, right? Like,
yeah,
given the level of
exactly.
nerd radiating here.
Yeah, exactly. So what was it like? I think Fridays are it's party pump Fridays. That's when you go work out your biceps to make them really pumped up. So when you go out, you look jacked. And then
Okay. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
the meathead Mondays. So anyway, how was your weekend?
It was good. I mean, got some good Mexican food on Saturday, as you know. We're there.
Oh yeah, that's right.
By the way, I mean, every town kind of has its own flavor of food, but Salt Lake is a good place for Mexican food. People in California and Arizona might argue, but my brother in New Jersey says they just don't have anything that's comparable to what we have in the West. So
Well, it is what it is. But they got a lot of good food over there too.
they
So
do. It's just not Mexican food necessarily.
yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, today we want to talk about multi-cloud and some pros and cons of multi-cloud. I think there's depending what stats you read, it seems like either everybody's using multi-cloud or it's just getting started. I have no idea what to believe on this one, frankly, but
Right.
in either case, there's a lot of activity. So yeah, what are your thoughts on multi-cloud? Then we'll get to this Wall Street Journal article that I sent you over the weekend that sort of spawned this conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, the funny thing is, we've also been writing about this in the book, kind of around the same time. So we had two events hit that were like, okay, this is probably something that we should talk about.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's definitely in the air. I think there are a lot of arguments for multi-cloud. Some of those I consider maybe more valid than others. And then a new development is what we call cloud of clouds, and that changes the multi-cloud conversation significantly. And so we'll loop back in a minute to what that is exactly and how it changes the game for multi-cloud. I mean, fundamentally, multi-cloud is complicated if you roll your own, right? If I have to manage Azure and AWS permissions and then integrate the networks across, that is not an easy process.
That sounds fun for nobody.
Right, exactly right. Companies have been doing this for years, right? But it means you have to have a lot of good engineers. And ideally, some of them are certified on both clouds so they can actually handle the integration part. But yeah, Cloud of Clouds changes that conversation. And so we'll loop back to that, the specifics of that after looking at this article a bit.
Yeah, cool. Speaking of which, let's pull up the article.
Yeah.
Let me just get that over here. Yes, the article is Wells Fargo embraces multi-cloud with Microsoft and Google deals. Again, this is saw this over the weekend. Obviously, you can tell that Matt and I live very exciting lives when I share this on a Saturday morning with him, thinking this is awesome. But it is what it is. We're dorks. That's fine. So, yeah, what were your thoughts on this article? I mean, it talks about obviously how Wells Fargo went with both Microsoft and Google for their public clouds. But what caught your attention on this?
Yeah, so there were a couple of things. One thing that got my attention is they were talking about outages and problems they've had with their infrastructure. And it's funny, like outages are just not something we're accustomed to anymore. Back in the 90s, like, of course, websites are going to go down. Of course, they're going to have scheduled maintenance. But in 2021, if a bank website goes down, for example, for a while, people get really upset. And that is a big driver for consideration of a cloud strategy. And potentially, frankly, a multi-cloud strategy, especially if you really have your app running on both clouds where it's not a big deal to flip the switch and make it entirely on AWS, GCP, Azure, whatever. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've all seen a couple of outages. I'm aware of some with GCP and AWS. They were
and also
regional. Yeah,
outages also with underlying technologies like what was it, Cloudflare or something like that, where that goes out and like the internet shuts off, right? So. I mean, that could happen too, but
yeah, but like Kinesis, right? Kinesis went out and what was it, US East 1 or something, and it basically took down all of US East 1 because Kinesis runs everything these days. Like, it's integrated with everything else practically.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, both the internal systems at AWS as well, not just blatantly using purchasing the tool, but obviously it's used in a lot of underlying applications. So
exactly,
yeah.
But it's also just the scaling discussion. And so if if you are on a cloud, generally you can scale up pretty fast. I mean, obviously there are some limits, right? Fundamentally, at some point, the instances, resources in a region are going to run out, but the pool you're pulling from is so much bigger than your pool of your own data centers.
Right.
Wells Fargo cited a couple of specific reasons for going multi-cloud. They basically said that, what was it? They were going to use Azure for some core workloads, and then they were interested in using GCP for machine learning.
Yeah, this one here.
Yeah, it's kind of mirrors what we've seen, we really like the machine learning technologies and data technologies on GCP. But if you're a Microsoft shop, like I've done Microsoft deployments on AWS, and it is not fun. It's a total nightmare. And a lot of stuff that is a headache on AWS is just turnkey on Azure. And it makes sense, right? It's a Microsoft product. It is the Microsoft cloud, even if they support Linux pretty well now. And so the other motivation they had was just risk mitigation. In other words, not like financial risk mitigation, but vendor lock-in mitigation, basically.
Right, and competency mitigation too. Like the article points out, one public cloud provider, they didn't go with that just because each vendor has its own different competencies. And I think that's a pretty key point. And we'll get more into that in a bit. But increasingly, what I think you're going to see is if you choose to go multi-cloud, it's because either you want to mitigate risks to your application in general, and there are best of breed toolings within each cloud that you want to take advantage of. So
and so like AWS, right? What does AWS do well? Well, they dominate mindshare. There's no question about that. It's easier to find, I believe, easier to find AWS cloud engineers than engineers for any other cloud. It just seems to be a reality right now.
Yeah,
the products are just best in class, right? S3 is amazing. AWS Lambda, EC2 is really solid, and everyone knows how to use EC2. Right? So, whereas, again, Azure, talking Microsoft, and then GCP is just really good for data technologies. Their networking is awesome.
Yeah, I mean, so it's so if you wanted to go multi-cloud, I mean, what are some of the options at your disposal today?
Okay, so one is roll your own, and it seems like that's what Wells Fargo is doing, although maybe that strategy will change over time. So in other words, you are going to develop some kind of integration layer to manage permissions cross-cloud. Maybe you're going to use Active Directory as your core identity management, but then somehow push identities to Google Cloud, for example. A new option on the scene is what we call Cloud of Clouds. And the idea with Cloud of Clouds is that someone else handles cloud integration for you. And interestingly, a lot of the compelling Cloud of Cloud products are coming from the cloud vendors themselves.
Right.
So, technically, so I'll kind of roll in hybrid cloud. I don't want to muddy the conversation too much, but hybrid cloud is related to Cloud of Clouds and to multi-cloud. And so AWS pushed out Outposts. Outposts is strictly for on-prem. They basically ship you server racks, and you have access to all kinds of AWS services on-prem, like S3 and EC2, within the limits of whatever you purchase from them, of course.
Right.
You have access to all these services. And then more recently, and this is an interesting thing with Kubernetes, we've seen what's called EKS Anywhere from AWS, presumably in response to Google Anthos, which we'll talk about in a second. The idea with EKS Anywhere is that you can deploy Kubernetes onto on-prem clusters or to GCP or Azure. And now AWS is managing that for you. So it's just like regular EKS. You have a central pane of glass, and you can choose where the workloads deploy, but otherwise it's a lot like doing things within AWS itself. Anthos offering I mentioned, Anthos is the backbone of Google's hybrid cloud and Cloud of Cloud strategy. Anthos is just Kubernetes that deploys to other clouds or to on-prem hardware. And I believe, don't quote me on this, but I think it's supported on AWS and on Azure out of the box. It's just
I think it's out of preview with AWS now. I'm not sure about Azure, but yeah.
Another for us in the data space, we're really interested in Cloud of Clouds data technologies. And so Snowflake, not a primary cloud vendor, but they essentially have a multi-cloud Cloud of Clouds product. And the way it works is you do have to set up multiple Snowflake accounts. So you have to have a Snowflake account for each region. So say I'm on Google, US West 3, that's going to be, well, I don't know if it's supported. They only support certain regions. But anyway, each region I'm interested in, I deploy And then I can copy data pretty seamlessly between my regions. And so, for example, I can spin up processes, data transformations on GCP, and then seamlessly copy the data over to Azure. And obviously there are some charges, but it's a very simple process. And even though I have multiple accounts, it's essentially a single pane of glass in the sense that it's always the same Snowflake interface, no matter where I am. It's the same Snowflake processes. The only difference maybe being the way you interact with Azure Blob Storage versus Google Cloud Storage versus Amazon S3 is going to be slightly different. But otherwise, the Snowflake product itself is almost identical across clouds.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other interesting one is BigQuery Omni, which is Google's BigQuery product, competitor to Snowflake in many respects. But they, behind the scenes, it's Anthos, but they basically allow you to move BigQuery workloads to any cloud. And their pitch is that they're taking compute to your data. So in other words, it's still BigQuery. It's running on top of your data wherever it happens to exist. So that's a pretty exciting one, especially since, you know, so many of the compelling use cases for the cloud are in the analytics space. To have these multi-cloud, cloud of clouds, database options is pretty sweet, I think. BigQuery Omni is still in alpha, so we'll see what it looks like when it comes out. I haven't heard a lot for over a year, so hopefully something is coming down the pipe there.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it's a really cool idea.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens with it, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think Google's pitch is that it really is a single pane of glass. In other words, instead of having to have multiple Snowflake accounts, in theory, you'll have one GCP account that can point to all these different clouds. So that could be pretty sweet when it's actually delivered, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. On that note, too, I think one thing we're starting to come across more and more is orchestration across clouds.
Yes.
This actually presents a pretty interesting, I wouldn't say dilemma, but it seems like we're still in early days of multi-cloud orchestration, for example. Like we have customers that you know, may want to use Airflow to control you know, resources and workflows in various clouds.
Right.
So,
exactly.
but the Airflow is hosted in one cloud, and then it manages resources in other clouds, for example. So it's a workflow we're seeing more and more of.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think one of the compelling reasons that Airflow came out in the first place was that with Control-M, I think with Control-M, which is a more traditional enterprise orchestration solution, you can control multiple tools, but typically it's used to like orchestrate a Teradata system or an Oracle system, just kind of stick to one system. And Airflow was designed to like orchestrate a bunch of different services. Like it's all written in Python. And so the assumption is that any service that has a Python client or anything that you can communicate with, say, using the request library and REST APIs, you could control with Airflow.
Right.
And it's still cross-cloud data movement is still a tricky problem. Maybe you can talk about that briefly, but it's something if you're just coming to the cloud, you may not be aware of.
Well, I mean, the biggest issue is egress fees.
Yep.
Right. So every cloud. Here's the secret, and I think this is it's something we talk a lot about for some reason, but egress fees, right? Yep. So you move your data, say, out of the cloud, you have to pay for that. Right. So, and it's not cheap. So clouds do this to keep you in their cloud for obvious reasons. But this is definitely a gotcha. We see people, I think, spinning up resources in a cloud and say they want to use BigQuery. So, they're in AWS. I want to move my data over to BigQuery so I can analyze it. Well, that's going to cost you. AWS is going to charge you to move that data into GCP. And then if you want to move your data out of GCP back to AWS, then you get to pay that again. So it's a toll, essentially, right? So this, we've heard stories about some engineering teams spinning up, doing exporting data out of a cloud to another cloud, and ending up getting very surprisingly large bills on the order of tens of thousands of dollars for that month. Not knowing, I would say, about egress fees. So it's something you want to keep in mind. This is the single biggest factor I could see, or single biggest gotcha off the bat that's going to impact your ability to use multi-cloud.
Exactly right. So, So
Mm-hmm.
if you have a multi-cloud strategy, you really need to understand what those data flows are going to look like. And one typical hybrid cloud scenario is that you put your production workloads, so your web servers, on-prem, and then you push the data to, say, Google BigQuery. And that way, the nice thing is, so clouds, a lot of people have pointed out that the egress fees are kind of unfair considering actual networking costs. But the point is that the clouds subsidize you in certain areas so that they can charge you more in other areas. And so pushing to the cloud is completely free. So you can
of course it is.
Well, I mean, you have to pay for your network connection that you bought, for your your company,
Right, but it's still trivial.
it's still trivial.
Right? So,
because
and you can pay for stuff like a private link if you wanted to, or some sort of a direct VPN, direct connector, something like that. If you really wanted a secure connection as well. So.
But one interesting thing with that is I think typically egress fees are discounted if you have the right type of network connection. I don't know that they're free, but they're less.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It can be.
Yeah.
So,
and that's where I kind of wonder if we're going to see eventually more what I would call cloud fabric companies, where these would be companies that would maybe host data outside of clouds on their own storage systems and then connect using these high-speed connections so that you'd have discounted egress when you need to push data back. I don't know, but I don't know what the status of Wasabi storage is. They pitched themselves as an alternative.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah. But they use Direct Connect to keep those fees down so you can keep your data, you can move data back and forth from Wasabi storage cheaply was the idea. And it's supposed to be pretty fast under certain circumstances.
Right. Yeah. Then, I mean, there's also, third-party vendors, not the clouds aren't third-party vendors, but like DigitalOcean, for example, and Linode. Right. So you could use those services as well. And interact with AWS. I mean, I've done that before and it worked just fine. DigitalOcean's pretty nice, actually. So you just want cheap servers. Yeah, it's dope.
Yeah, I've heard like you can spin up tiny servers, like tiny units of compute pretty cheaply. There's the droplet concept, right? That's the thing they've really pushed. So, yeah. But I think the point is, well, I'll bring up one more technology in just a second here, but I think the point is that the multi-cloud space, I mean, even the cloud space itself, right? What's the stat that people cite sometimes? I don't remember off the top of my head, but like only a tiny slice of cloud migration has happened according to many analyses. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I think drives us crazy because, depending who you, what you read and who you talk to, cloud migrations might be at, you might have 25% penetration.
Yeah.
30%. On the other hand, I read stats where everyone's in the cloud, but these are the same stats where I also read everyone's using AI, and so I don't know what to believe. I think what it means is you might be using something like Google Workspaces or Office 365 Online, which is technically a cloud product, right? And then those have AI-enabled apps behind the scenes. So if you really wanted to stretch your argument really, really far that you're using AI in cloud, then I suppose that's one way to do it.
Yeah. And from what I've seen, what this comes down to is any big company we go to, someone somewhere in that company, in addition to spinning up a SaaS type workload, so software as a service cloud workload, has spun up, BigQuery or Snowflake or Databricks or something, but it's just used by one team and it's not very large yet.
Right.
And, salespeople are just salivating over these companies because they're like, okay, if I can get a foot in the door, then I can scale up and hopefully I can get their entire workload eventually. But
that's the goal.
Yeah.
There's this concept called data gravity. So for people who are working with clouds, there's a reason why, your salesperson for that cloud might be wanting you to move your data workloads first.
Yeah.
Like we said with egress fees, for one, it's hard to get out. Two, once your data's in place somewhere, guess what you build around it? Applications. So it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the clouds make their money off of two main things: compute and storage.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I think who was it? Corey Quinn. He runs he runs a firm that analyzes. I think he calls himself a cloud economist or something. But he'll look at bills, and I think what he estimated, like 70%. Don't quote me on this, but a large chunk of the spend was compute related for a person's cloud or a company's cloud bill.
Yeah, well, because if you look at how a lot of these services work, aside from like BigQuery, which is serverless, and AWS Lambda, which is serverless, things like EMR itself is very cheap, right? I think they charge you something for EMR, but the cost is all the servers you spin up, basically, and the SSD drives you spin up. Like, you spin up a big Hadoop cluster, it's going to cost you some money, but all in compute and storage, basically.
Well, which brings us back to multi-cloud. So one approach to handling a multi-cloud scenario is to spin up something like Kubernetes. Right, because that gives you ultimate flexibility across every cloud. But guess what happens when you spin up Kubernetes? That usually comes with a very, I would say, significant cost in terms of server clusters that you're now managing, as well as the underlying storage. So Kubernetes is actually it's a windfall for the clouds in a lot of ways because I mean this is exactly where they make their money. It's also convenient for you as a user because your application is portable, but don't think that this is you're going to save money strictly from not use from avoiding managed services, for example, which is the argument I've heard from people who take this approach where, oh, I'm in Kubernetes, therefore, and I don't need to use managed services. I'll avoid all of those and simply spin everything up on my own. Well, it's a trade-off.
It is a trade-off. Yeah. And Kubernetes, there's a high overhead management cost to Kubernetes as well, especially if you roll your own. Like,
oh dear, don't do that.
Yeah. But even if you're using something like EKS, for example, a managed Kubernetes service, there's a lot of work to actually manage Kubernetes and to manage all the jobs and everything else. So you typically have to have some kind of ops team as you start scaling up. So there are definitely trade-offs. That's the point. There
are trade-offs. So we talked about multi-cloud. We talked about some of the, we talked about cloud of clouds as well, which I think is a cool concept.
Yeah.
What are some of the pros of taking a multi-cloud approach?
So I think the ones Wells Fargo mentioned, right? I think these two are the primary drivers. Specialized services. So we'll often see that someone adopts, say, BigQuery on Google because they have Google Ads data they want to query, and you can do that directly from BigQuery, but they're primarily on AWS or Azure. And so they'll do analytics on one cloud, and then they'll do their applications on another. And like I said, they have to watch out about how they move that data around.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of strategy that they might adopt. Again, there's this risk mitigation question, like how do I avoid vendors jacking up my prices? Or what if in the future one vendor falls behind technologically? How do I mitigate that risk? Well, if you're already in multiple clouds, those problems are going to be mitigated quite a bit. So you can just spin up more workload on whichever cloud is cheaper or has better services in the future. A third argument in favor, let's see, what else would you say? Like, what are the other big drivers for companies?
I think you hit on the big ones, really. Yeah. It's flexibility, but again, what we talked about earlier, the flexibility that does have trade-offs, right? So, but I would, increasingly we see kind of what you're hinting at, best of breed technologies being adopted across the clouds, and maybe you pay egress fees, and that's a tax you have to pay. But then again, you get the advantage of using best of breed services. Like I think we see, a common use case is really if you're in AWS, you can go with Snowflake. But increasingly, I think we see people just, because they have ads data in Google, they might just use BigQuery as well, either as an intermediate landing zone for all that ads and Google Analytics 4 data, and then bring that over to AWS or Snowflake, or just using BigQuery on its own and saying, well, we'll just use that for our analytics, and that's kind of how it is. So. Yeah.
And I think companies are increasingly looking at management overhead, and I don't think that was the case a few years ago, and I think it is a big cultural change. But one nice thing about BigQuery, it is easier to manage than Redshift, unquestionably. Like Redshift is a great product, but it's way more complicated to use than BigQuery in general. And some companies are like, wait, maybe we should just focus on our data and not focus on like database tuning and that kind of stuff and move into this kind of service. Yeah. Another one I think we should mention is if you're a SaaS vendor, or if you interact, if you have a lot of customers and you're exchanging data with them, then being on multiple clouds can make sense because you want to bring your product close to where they're operating.
Oh, big time.
Yeah. So like Snowflake itself, right? That's part of their strategy. They want to be close to customers who are on Azure, AWS, GCP. So
well, there's a strategic reason for that too. If you're a SaaS vendor, being a technology partner with these clouds makes a ton of sense, because guess who's going to make your life a lot easier? The cloud salespeople, for example, they're incentivized, on selling either the cloud's products or marketplace products, i.e., technology partner products. They're not incentivized to sell products that aren't in the marketplace or products that cloud doesn't sell.
Yeah.
And so if you're a technology vendor, you have every reason to want to partner with these clouds, because you have, the full force of their sales teams behind you. Otherwise, you're at actually a pretty big disadvantage, and we've seen this happen before.
Yeah.
Then you have to work through a bunch of machinations to make your product work on that cloud. So.
Yeah. And if you're on AWS and GCP, it gives you leverage against both of those, right? Like you can say, well, you can.
Are you talking as a customer or as a vendor?
Sorry, if you're Snowflake, you're a vendor of some SaaS product and you're on AWS and GCP, if AWS isn't playing ball, you can say, well, I can just try to get my customers to move to
Or like
GCP.
Azure, probably a better
Azure.
example.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, in their case. But yeah, and I think this is also the pro, you bring up negotiation. This is also a pro of being, if you're going to go multi-cloud, this does give you, leverage in negotiations for pricing, for example.
Yeah.
Right. Because especially if you're in all three, for example, then it's, you can pit all three against each other. And that's a great, game theory scenario. So, but it's not like these clouds haven't thought of this either. They're like, we're when we sign you up, we're probably anticipating this is going to happen. So,
there's a lot of game theory going on right now, right?
Yeah.
Like these battles or these like Cold Wars. It's more like a Cold War. None of this is settled. Like there's a lot of like pushing and pulling going on behind the scenes.
Well, and so back to egress fees, I think it presents a very, talking about game theory, a very interesting prisoner's dilemma scenario. Where I think somebody's going to drop egress fees at some point, and then the rest of the industry is going to follow. Because at that point, you have no reason to keep them. So I expect it, because egress fees remind me a lot of cell phone minutes that you used to have on your phone back in like the late 90s and early 2000s, where it was like, I need to buy like 4 hours for the month or something, right? And so you're allotted your minutes and so forth. And if you went over, it was some exorbitant charge. But then, who thinks of cell phone minutes these days?
I know.
Nobody.
And even data, increasingly, like data caps are disappearing as well.
Right. Because my argument is, I hear people saying, well, the network costs are sort of it's subsidized. Like, well, greater usage of compute will more than make up for the egress fees.
Or they'll just discount them, right? They'll go to a model where you're paying closer to the real cost of that network transfer, which might be 10% of the egress fees right now. It's going to be way, way cheaper.
Right.
And the other thing is, if you cut those fees, then the clouds have incentives to actually build out networks, which frankly, Google has probably done the best job of that. I think largely because they already had those networks for their own products. Like AWS relies on just the open internet to move data between regions. Google is the one vendor that has its own like overlay network that handles everything.
And it's pretty sick.
It's pretty cool. Yeah. So I could see, now the interesting thing was this last year during the pandemic was that Zoom went to Oracle Cloud, and people were like, why would they go to Oracle Cloud? Because, they're still not a big player. Like they're scrappy, but they're not big in this space. And the reason was that if you're a video conference vendor, you're doing a lot of egress, right? You're pushing a lot of data streams from servers, and Oracle heavily discounted the egress for them. And so I'm wondering if that might be kind of the first domino, and we might see more movement in the space within the next year or two. So
maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe Oracle Cloud becomes the dominant cloud. I don't know. It's hard to predict this stuff. It
really is. Who knows?
I mean, it's hard. You forecast out 5 years.
Yeah.
I can't tell you what happens. Anyone who says they think they know what happens, I think it's totally full of it too. Things are moving too fast.
Yeah, and there are going to be some, upstart disruptors as well at some point, right? Like everyone kind of assumes that we're locked in, but I think who knows? Maybe DigitalOcean will become a really big cloud player someday. And
it might be decentralized too. I mean, I was talking to a friend the other day about this. He described it as sort of the cloud oligarchies or oligopolies. And the only thing that, in situations like this, what happens is that the way you get disrupted is to simply invert the business model. And flip it on its head. And in that case, it is decentralized. So I could see this maybe as a scenario, especially with all the buzz around stuff like blockchain and just, Web 3.0 and all this other stuff. But we'll see. It could happen. So what are some cons of multi-cloud?
So, we recommend most customers avoid this at first.
Multi-cloud, you mean?
Avoid multi-cloud. And it's largely a question of complexity, right? It's like banks have deep pockets, right? That banks have a lot of money. They're financial institutions. And so it kind of makes sense for them to consider doing this. If you're a smaller company, you're trying to run lean, like don't start out this way unless it's just like a really simple, there are scenarios like, right, okay, maybe you run Google BigQuery and then you run everything else on another cloud or something simple like that. But like truly complex multi-cloud deployment scenarios are going to overwhelm your team, especially while you're migrating. Like just focus on that initial migration first. And the other advice we give customers is like, it's not that you should be able to move immediately to another cloud, but kind of have the exit plan. It's kind of like your plans for nuclear war, if that makes sense. Like you've got secret binders and vaults to say, if this happens, this is what we do. You should kind of know, okay, if something went wrong with AWS, say the pricing got really expensive, how long would it take me to migrate? Maybe you're talking 2 years or something like that. What would it take me to migrate? What would it take to migrate from Kinesis to PubSub or Kafka or some other streaming,
Right.
queuing service. Just have that scenario available, but don't necessarily. One thing we'd like to say is there's lock-in with any product, right? People talk like
There
open
is.
source doesn't have lock-in. It's like, well, no, if I standardize on Spark, that's a form of lock-in. It's not
Yep.
just vendor lock-in. So just understand where you're locked in and what it's going to take to get out if you ever have to, and maintain that scenario for an emergency. Consider it a broken glass thing, but mostly focus on one cloud unless you have a really compelling reason to be multi-cloud, because it's just a lot of complexity to manage.
It's a lot of complexity.
Yeah.
I would say that, another reason to choose it is if your customers demand it. Say, I know one company that had clients that demanded, different clients demanded different clouds. So
Exactly.
this company was on all three by necessity. Yeah. So they had to write their tooling in such a way that it all interoperated across all three clouds.
Yeah.
Which was a lot of work.
It is.
So,
but if there's enough money in it, then you're going to do it, right? What we typically see with SaaS startups is they'll start on AWS. They'll have a roadmap of like, next we're going to go to Azure, or next we're going to go to GCP.
Yeah.
But they first have to build their business and show revenue streams on AWS. And then they can go into a funding round and say, part of this funding round is to build out on Azure, because we have a really successful product on AWS, and we think we can really scale out on Azure. So,
yeah, makes sense.
But yeah, increasingly that's the case. I mean, who knows? But maybe someday you'll even see like Office 365 running on AWS or something, just for this reason, because even Microsoft has had to play ball to some extent, like adopting Linux, for example, the viral GPL, right?
Right. It's funny. Well, I mean, as the old saying goes, you fish where the fish are, right?
That's exactly right.
So,
yeah.
And AWS has a lot of fish right now.
That's right. But even AWS were forced, like they dragged their feet on going cloud of clouds, but even they have EKS anywhere. That was a big deal. It kind of happened quietly, but that was like a big change in their strategy. So,
yeah. Cool. Surprised there's no questions right now. If the audience has questions, type them in the chats. We'll get to them. Otherwise, you just get to hear Matt and I continue to blab
we're
for
just
a bit.
like talking into the air or something. Maybe that's what's.
No, I mean, this is kind of funny though. Like we were saying last week, this is the kind of stuff that we just talk about anyway. Like if you watch the Monday morning data chat, this is literally just Matt and I having our conversations that we always have. It's literally no different, except there's Q&A and all that kind of stuff.
People listening in theory. So
people listening and yeah.
Let's talk about Pulsar a bit. I'm not a Pulsar expert, but I think we both listened to some podcasts about Pulsar and how it was designed. And it's
we know a lot of people that use Pulsar too.
A lot of people use it. Yeah. And one of the big things was that, so here's the thing about Kafka. Like Kafka in some ways is kind of old and creaky. It's like one of the best options around. It's a default just because it interoperates with everything. You can find tons of Kafka engineers. On the other hand, like scaling is a pain. Some of these things that we take for granted with other products are a pain. But the point is with Pulsar, they built something brand new to like try to solve particular problems that they saw with Kafka. And so one of those was that they designed it to be like multi-data center, multiple cloud out of the box without like just very seamless replication. Like it's designed to do this from the get-go. And so something to think about if you're looking at a multi-cloud like queuing strategy. Frequently we just recommend that people stick with the native queues, native messaging buses like Kinesis or GCP PubSub, for example. But yeah, if you have to go multi-cloud, then Pulsar might be at least worth considering for something that can manage those message buses across multiple clouds.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, I would say stick with the managed stuff for now until you have a compelling reason to, get a more sophisticated. Like PubSub, and if you're in GCP, PubSub takes you a long way.
It really does.
I remember Spotify, for example, I remember reading when they tried, when they were trialing GCP, they turned on PubSub and automatically threw like 2 or 3 million messages at it just off the bat per second. And it just didn't even skip a beat. So
yeah. And I call PubSub an example of doing less or doing more by doing less. And what I mean by that is that instead of making like this universal messaging service that would do all kinds of cool data processing, PubSub is very, very simple for the most part. Like it really doesn't process any data internally. It's just designed to, handle message queues and fan out messages and things like that. And then the assumption is that any processing will happen inside of Apache Beam or some other service afterward. And so Kafka takes a slightly different model where it does, you have KSQL, you have some internal processing tools. And then Kinesis has added various other things that can process streams in a fairly integrated manner. So.
Yeah, but I mean, if you needed to, though, you could use the connectors too. So like Kafka to PubSub, or I don't know if Pulsar has a PubSub one yet, but it's just not the end of the world, right? So, and that sort of bridges a gap where if you had like sort of this, a messaging layer that could kind of work between the clouds, and then say you wanted to use a cloud specific meshing system, you could certainly do that. I think there's a lot of flexibility in all these approaches. So
there is, yeah. And then one of the cool things, I mean, if you want to try cool cloud technologies, I mean, I think PubSub is probably one of the most underappreciated technologies. I mean, people at Google obviously know about it, but if I spin up Kinesis, I have to like set shards and a few other things, right? Like it's pretty simple, but there is some configuration. With PubSub, it's pretty much like cloud storage. Like I just define a topic and that's it. And there's no sharding or anything like that. And then, like you said, you could just start throwing messages at it and we'll scale up.
It's that easy.
Yeah.
So don't mean this to be a PubSub infomercial or Pulsar infomercial, but we're fans of the technology we like. So
and the thing is, like, it's trade-offs, right? It's all about trade-offs when you're evaluating architectures. We're actually not saying that PubSub is superior to Kafka or that Pulsar is superior to Kafka. It's just each of these technologies has some strengths and weaknesses. And when you're deciding on what cloud you want to land on, these are key considerations, right? It's like, what are really the core services for my business? What do I want to focus on? That should help to inform your decision. Is it Microsoft? Is it easy access to talent with AWS? Is it something like PubSub with Google? Like these are all questions you have to answer.
Yeah. Speaking of questions to answer, if you have any questions in the audience, let us know. Otherwise, I think Matt and I are going to drop off in just a bit. So, cool. I'll give it about a minute. So,
okay.
Yeah, another news. We just read this morning that Fivetran, one of our partners, actually just acquired one of our other partners, HVR. And just announced a very big, I think $565 million raise. So that was awesome to read this morning. So congrats to Fivetran and the continued success.
Are we going to get any trouble if we talk about this with our partner agreements?
No, it's a PR newswire. So
I just mean public. In terms of talking about strategy. I mean, the surprising thing here is that I consider HVR like much more of a traditional enterprise company. They come out of those enterprise roots, whereas Fivetran, you interacted with Fivetran years and years ago. Like they were very much like a scrappy startup type company.
No, I remember they'd emailed back in the day asking, "Hey, do you want to try out our new product that connects, Postgres to Redshift?" So I had a Postgres instance and was running on Redshift, and I was like, "Oh, that seems silly. Like, why would you ever want to do that? I can write my own connectors or something." And so, I ended up looking, in retrospect, that was, not the best move, but. It is what it is, and that's why I say it's hard to predict where this technology goes. And so that's why I also say anyone who says they know where the future is going, I mean, you might, but I think you're wrong, and I think you're probably full of it, and so all that stuff, because it's just every time. I mean, I've been in technology long enough to know that anytime you think you have a good handle on where things are going, you end up being surprised, because innovation by definition means it's unexpected, right? And this is exactly what propels technology forward. It's not incremental, I guess progression, right? It's when you see inflection points. That's what changes things. Yeah, it's never 1-to-1, or it's always something that's totally different. We do have a comment here, by the way. Yay! I guess this topic maybe isn't the most popular one, but whatever. All right, what's up, man? I see many organizations who manage to answer part one of the question, what core capabilities do they need, but fail to answer to what cloud services deliver these capabilities. What's your opinion on that?
I mean, I think one of the problems here is that engineers and consultants tend to focus on one cloud, maybe two. And so there's just a lack of general knowledge about what these clouds can do. Even for us, I got to say, like, I read up on Azure services. I don't know. I'm not that deep on Azure services compared to like AWS and GCP. Yeah. But it just pays to really get informed. And, realistically, you kind of need to talk to people who've used those clouds a lot and get their opinions. And frankly, probably it might be worthwhile to bring in a couple of different consultants from specialists in those clouds so they can kind of have a bake-off on their services. Because like, if you're not super familiar with GCP, then you won't know that PubSub is hyper scalable. You also won't know that PubSub is very bare bones. Like it doesn't do any processing like Kafka does or Kinesis does to some extent. And so, answering that question, it really requires deep knowledge that is very hard to acquire on your own. Like read up, but then talk to a lot of people who have actually. It's
deep knowledge, and there's a lot of noise out there. Frankly, I would say, given the number of just products there are right now, it's hard to I guess filter out like what's a marketing pitch and what's good documentation.
Yeah. Yeah. And even in the database space, I mean, fundamentally, there are really only a few ways to make databases fast for the most part. And you'll see these new pitches like this database is like 50 times better than this other one. It's like, well, yeah, in this particular type of performance, it's faster. And here's why, because it's using in-memory computation or SSD or whatever. And here are ways in which it's going to be costly, and understanding those trade-offs like just requires some deeper level of knowledge. Like if you just read the pitches or even the benchmarks that they put out, it's like, okay, but what are we talking? Small data benchmarks? Are we talking truly big data benchmarks? Are we talking transactional? Like, what are we actually talking about when we're comparing performance? Because yes, if you take Snowflake and you try to do transactional inserts, it's going to be really, really slow. That's not what it's designed for.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's also a mismatch between, I think, what he describes as question one and question two, which is core capabilities versus services to deliver these capabilities. That's a constant mismatch that we see a lot.
It is.
So
yeah,
it's a hard one to answer.
Yeah, and it just seems like, well, I don't know if this is fair to say, but like if you've been focusing on on-prem services, then you may just not really be aware of what cloud services are even competitive with those on-prem services, right? Like a lot of people struggle with the transition from just running their own open source to managed services, whether those are proprietary managed services or managed open source,
It happens a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah, don't feel bad if you can't figure out the best technologies. I think half the time we can't either. So
yeah, I mean, we do invest a lot in staying abreast of what's going on. But yeah, I recognize the limits of my knowledge. Like I know I've done some work in Azure, but I'm not an Azure expert, for example. I know it's really good for Microsoft stuff. I don't know the ins and outs of all their products by any means. So.
I was about to take their data engineering exam several months ago, but I would say I'm slightly familiar with it. But even then, it doesn't. I don't feel like I've compared to GCP or AWS, where I think I'm actually really expert in those areas.
Right.
Compared to Azure, not as expert. But that said, I think once you understand like the basics of how a cloud works, it's easy to translate that general knowledge to another cloud, but it's always the specific tools and the details of those that get you. So again, back to multi-cloud, if you're going to just, port things over using Kubernetes, that's fine. That, how that works. Networking should be about as straightforward. With some nuances, permissioning, same, but, how does Spanner work versus Cosmos, right? Like the details of that, or Aurora, like that, those are conversations where you're going to have to do just plain hard work. There's no way around it. But knowing those three trade-offs might be a good thing if you anticipate going into more than one cloud. So, Matt, do you know any jokes for him? He has to teach some students from New York tomorrow. Never been there.
Oh man, I don't know. I'll see if I can think of anything. We'll have to connect on LinkedIn. We'll have to talk on LinkedIn, I guess.
Yeah, hit us up with messages. I can't think of anything offhand, but if the audience has any ideas, put them in the chat right now.
Yeah.
So yeah. I can't think of anything. Sorry, but it's cool you get to teach some students from New York. That's awesome.
What are you teaching?
That might be a good place to start.
Curious what you're teaching.
So, that's awesome. Well, cool. Anything else in your mind, Matt?
I think that's it for now. Yeah, I think we've said most of it for the time being.
Yeah, I mean, multi-cloud, to kind of recap, I think, there's definitely some pros and cons. Like everything, there's trade-offs, right? So I can't say that going multi-cloud is going to be the best approach for you. I can't say it's going to be the worst approach for you either. So, Mike has a question here. So, Mike, hey, chaps, late to the party. I always like how he calls us chaps. It's really cool. With choosing cloud, multi-cloud, do you go for one vendor that has some features or go multi-cloud to have all the features? That's actually a really good question.
Yeah. And my bias, like I said earlier, is to always start with a single cloud strategy. Like there should be a really compelling reason before you're going multi-cloud, because like managing one cloud is complex enough. You're just embracing a lot of complexity, which sometimes makes sense, but you need a strong argument to go in that direction.
Yeah, I agree. If you were to flip the question, I suppose, what might be an answer as well? If you were to choose multi-cloud first by default, what would be an argument for that?
Yeah, and it would be some of the things we brought up, right? There's risk mitigation, there's competencies. If you're a SaaS platform and you're going to be exchanging data with customers, or you need to run workloads close to their workloads, then multi-cloud makes sense.
So in Wells Fargo's case, the example we gave earlier, I mean, that made a lot of sense for them out of the bat to go multi-cloud because they're big enough. They're not startups. They have different requirements, like very unique ones too.
Yeah.
You're not just going to say, oh, well, I need to start slow and come out of the gate. It's like, no, I think if you're going to, go from on-prem to the cloud, you should do it that way. That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah, and banks frankly have deep pockets, and they have expensive problems too. So in other words, for a bank's website to go down, which is an issue they're apparently having, or other systems to go down, that's very, very expensive. And so for them, they want to just solve that issue up front. Yeah. And then, it again comes down to what we're talking about these cloud specializations. If you're heavy Microsoft, then Azure is probably just the right choice for you, because all those Microsoft products get more expensive, more complex to manage on other clouds. That's just a reality. And yet Azure is not necessarily the best for every service.
But no cloud's the best for every service.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but if you're Microsoft, I think, Azure makes a ton of sense out of the gate. Yeah. Just because they make it really easy to get into Azure. So
yeah, I mean, to the point where, as I understand it, I haven't used these features, but apparently newer versions of Windows Server have built-in hooks for Azure, like have integration out of the box, and so they've built in a hybrid cloud model for you. It's like
I have Windows 10 Pro here, and it's all baked in.
Yeah,
like if I wanted to go to Azure, it's like click, done.
Yep.
So,
or you can spin up AD on Azure and then just immediately bring a computer online with Active Directory.
Yeah.
Machine on-prem. So yeah, it's a very smart play for Microsoft, no doubt.
I guess to finalize it, so when would you never want to go to the cloud? If you want to stay on-prem or just adopt on-prem as a first-class citizen, and say you're a startup, you want to do on-prem, what would be some reasons for this?
That is a good question. So we talk about like data security, and it's not, I think clouds are secure for data, but there's some sensitivity about having certain data in the cloud, right? Some companies and organizations just simply don't want the appearance of having data in the cloud. That might be an argument. Another one we talked about is that if you're a certain type of service, then you basically are almost a cloud. And so you don't want to put your workloads on someone else's hardware. Like you're big enough to manage your own hardware. And one of these examples was Dropbox. And people cite Dropbox as like, oh, you should repatriate your data. You should bring it back to your own data centers because of Dropbox. Like, well, Dropbox is running a cloud storage product. That's their product, is cloud storage. And it's very, very high scale. It's lots and lots of disks. It's lots of network bandwidth. It's a very highly specialized synchronization system where being close to hardware makes sense. So if your intent is to be a cloud competitor, like DigitalOcean, or like an edge service like Cloudflare, then you probably don't want to be on someone else's hardware. Those are huge high bandwidth services where owning your own networks, owning your own data centers actually makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does.
Yeah. But then how do you start out that way, right? Like if I'm a small startup that's raised like $2 million in a seed round, buying my own hardware and data centers sounds.
I think your investors might think you're crazy at that point. So, these days, right? That's kind of what you had to do back in the day, but not anymore. I heard last week somebody was at my meetup saying, well, yeah, I mean, if you go to the cloud, then you have to deal with their security and they don't do it right. I'm like, well, who's to say you versus, their team of SREs and basically some of the best security people in the world, you're going to get it better than they are for your security. So I thought it was a bit silly.
Yeah.
But you with your server in your closet are going to do a better job than, an ARM data center with, again, some of the best specialists on the planet working at these places. I don't think so.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. And if you look so far, the security issues we've seen have almost universally been cloud misconfigurations. And so
it's been user error.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk about the shared responsibility model in another talk, but
it's
shared responsibility basically means there's a delineation between what you're responsible for and what the cloud is responsible for.
Right.
They're responsible for physical access, controls, all that kind of stuff. Server integrity, making sure it doesn't get flooded or catch on fire or something. Or if they do, then there's a backup really quickly.
Right.
That's not your responsibility. Your responsibility, though, is protecting your data assets and your infrastructure within that cloud. So don't leave your buckets open, for example, like your S3 buckets. Don't leave on your EC2 instances. Don't leave 0.0.0.0 open to anywhere for SSH. That's a common one that we see a lot, actually. Yeah. Or now you just basically opened your server up the entire, and we've seen this before. That's bananas. But people running production workloads with SSH port available anywhere.
Yeah,
And then you're gonna blame the cloud because they don't secure stuff.
It's like, well, you just left it open, and that's not even the worst example because at least there you have to have a key or something, right? But like the public SS or public S3 buckets is the one that gets.
That's a big
like,
one, dude.
You realize you just posted this data publicly. It's basically posted on a website publicly because you made it public. This is a big problem in the data space because what happens is data engineers or data scientists are like, oh, it's so easy to stand up S3. I could just dump data in, but they don't know anything about AWS. I've seen this happen before where someone's like, oh, I can't get to my data, and they keep tweaking permissions and they end up just making it public. It's like, well, that's because your keys weren't configured correctly. No. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Yeah. I think we better cut out. I think I have a contractor upstairs with the dogs about to
go ballistic
on him. So, yeah. Anyway, it's a good time to cut it out. Thanks for the questions, from the audience, and Myron, I hope you find some good New York City-based data jokes. I put you in touch with Jordan Goldmeyer, who will hopefully he lives in New York City and he also has data jokes, so you might be in the right hands with that one. You're in the wrong hands with Matt and I. We don't know
apparently
many jokes.
We're not very funny. Like,
yeah, we're not very funny. I watch a lot of stand-up comedy, but I don't really. Kind of bummed I didn't get tickets to go see Tom Segura. He's going to be here soon. So, but
maybe you could buy scalped tickets or something like
scalp tickets. Yeah, the only thing that's available, I think, were the wheelchair zones. I didn't want to be that guy rolling in with a wheelchair to go to the comedy show. It sounds like something you'd see on Curb Your Enthusiasm.
I've spent 2 months in a wheelchair, and I can tell you, it's breaking your leg just to go to a comedy show is not worth it. And I wouldn't. No,
totally not.
Like,
that's horrible.
Like,
but yeah, comedy's fun. I know Matt and we go to comedy shows a bit. So, but anyway, yeah, sorry. Just because we go to comedy shows doesn't mean we can tell you good jokes. So.
No.
Anyway, cool. Well, we'll see you all next week. I think we have a Let's Talk Data Engineering talk on Friday. Need to confirm. Starting actually in a couple of weeks, we're also going to be introducing a new live stream on Wednesdays. So we're going to be talking with cool products, cool technologies, that we like. So the people who run those technologies, not the technologies themselves. That'd be kind of a weird conversation. But yeah, stay tuned for that. I think that's going to be really cool. A lot of questions we get are, hey, tell me about X, Y, and Z new technology. And I'm like, well, why don't we just have them tell you about it themselves? And so that's going to be coming up, I think, starting, October 6th. So stay tuned for that. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. All right. Well, until next time, we'll see you next Monday for the Monday Morning Data Chat. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Ternary Data. If you like this content, feel free to subscribe and smash the like button. Also, we have a newsletter that comes out every Thursday. Go to ternarydata.com and subscribe to that. We have a lot of exclusive content, as well as a bunch of links that we find useful to data engineers like ourselves. So hopefully you'd like that too. And awesome. Yeah, thanks again for your support. Great questions, and we'll talk to you later. See you guys.
Thanks for joining.
Bye-bye.